What if you woke up to find that your peaceful beachside life was about to be shattered by a massive construction project? Imagine $150 million mansions going up right next to your home, blocking your view, cutting off your access, and ruining everything you've worked for. That's exactly what happened to me. But here's the twist. They didn't know I had something far more powerful than money or lawyers. I had a plan that would not only stop them, but leave them wishing they'd never messed with me. Want to know how it all went down? Comment below and let me know what you think. The sound of bulldozers at 6 a.m. jolted me awake. At first I thought it was temporary, but as I stepped out onto the porch, the destruction was everywhere. Trees gone, the peaceful horizon I cherished for decades blocked. This was more than construction. It was the beginning of my nightmare. The birds were drowned out by the roar of machines outside my home. My name's Evan Carter, a plumber for over 20 years. This house was passed down from my grandfather, built when this area was just coastline and fishing villages. Tell me where you're watching from, because I bet you'd understand why losing that would feel like losing a piece of your soul. But apparently, that peaceful life was about to become a distant memory, swept away by progress and profit margins. I stood there in my pajamas, coffee mug in hand, watching these machines tear apart the landscape that had been unchanged for decades. Ancient oak trees that had weathered countless storms were being uprooted like weeds. Rolling hills that had provided habitat for deer, rabbits, and countless bird species were being leveled into flat construction zones. The natural beauty that had drawn my grandfather to this spot was disappearing hour by hour, replaced by survey stakes, construction trailers, and enormous piles of earth that blocked my view of the horizon. I walked over to where the construction workers were setting up their command center, hoping to get some information about what exactly was happening to my neighborhood. That's when I saw the signs that made my blood run cold. 150 houses. I was stunned. From my little house with a perfect ocean view, I'd now only see a giant brick wall stretching as far as the eye could see. The project manager, this guy, in a hard hat who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else than dealing with curious neighbors, just shrugged when I asked about it. "Ocean View Estates," he said. Like that explained everything, and I should just accept it. Luxury mansions for the wealthy. I actually had to stop and stare at him after that one, because the irony was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. Luxury mansions. Right next to my modest family home that had been here since before most of these workers were born, the irony wasn't lost on me. They were calling it Ocean View Estates when they were about to block everyone else's ocean view permanently. It was like calling a prison Freedom Village, or naming a polluted river Crystal Creek. The audacity was breathtaking, but also terrifying, because it suggested these people lived in a completely different reality than the rest of us. They were building luxury mansions with artificial rivers and fountains blocking what was once my peaceful view. Each mansion would cost over $1 million, and they expected the entire project to take 18 months of constant construction. I asked about parking noise restrictions, construction hours, environmental impact, basic neighbor stuff that any reasonable person would consider. The responses I got made it clear they hadn't considered the existing residents at all. We were just obstacles to work around, inconveniences to be managed or eliminated. 2 days later, I received a notice in my mailbox that made my blood boil and my hands shake with anger. The beach path I'd walked every morning for 20 years was being closed permanently for safety reasons. This wasn't just any path. This was the only path to reach the ocean. From my property, the route my grandfather had used the trail, my father had maintained the walkway where I'd proposed to my ex-wife years ago. I'm not sure I was thinking clearly at that point, because I marched straight to the construction site office with the kind of righteous fury that makes people do stupid things. The woman there, some assistant with a clipboard and a rehearsed smile, just looked at me like I was a confused child having a temper tantrum. "Sir, this is private property now. You'll need to find another way to the beach." I tried explaining that this path had been public access for decades, that my family had maintained it, that closing it was probably illegal. But she just kept repeating the same scripted response about safety and private property like a broken robot programmed with corporate talking points. That's when I met Tom, my neighbor from 3 houses down, who I'd seen around but never really talked to before. He was standing by his fence watching the chaos unfold with this grim expression that told me he knew something I didn't, something that would make this situation even worse than it already appeared. "Evan," he said, shaking his head slowly, "this HOA has done this to 3 other families already. Anyone who wouldn't sell their land got harassed until they had to leave. The Johnson house over there, too. They finally sold for pennies. Chills ran down my spine thinking I could be the next target. Wait, was this really about forcing people out? That can't be right. Can it? Tom's voice had this defeated quality that scared me more than anything else he could have said. He'd clearly been dealing with this situation longer than I had, and the exhaustion in his eyes told me this wasn't going to be a simple neighborly dispute that could be resolved with reasonable conversation. Tom explained that the previous families had faced escalating problems, noise complaints filed against them for normal activities, property disputes over fence lines and tree boundaries, mysterious utility issues that seemed to happen right after they refused to sell, and constant legal pressure from expensive lawyers who specialized in intimidating regular people. Each family eventually gave up and sold their homes way below market value to the same development company that was now building this massive project. The pattern was too obvious to ignore once Tom laid it out for me. This wasn't about building luxury homes in harmony with the existing community. This was about acquiring the entire coastline by making life unbearable for existing residents until they surrendered and fled. I felt like I'd stumbled into some kind of corporate conspiracy, and suddenly my little plumber's life had become a David versus Goliath story, where I was definitely David, but I wasn't sure I had a slingshot. But as I watched those suited people surveying the area later that afternoon, laughing and talking like they'd already won some kind of game, I didn't even know I was playing. Something clicked in my mind. This wasn't a normal development project where neighbors learned to coexist. This was a systematic people removal strategy, and I was probably the main target because my property sat right in the middle of their planned community, making it the biggest obstacle to their grand vision. I decided right then and there, I'm not going anywhere. As a plumber, I understand every system in this area better than anyone, including water, sewage, electrical, and all the infrastructure that makes modern life possible. If they want war, we'll have war. Looking back, I probably should have known that decision would change everything, not just for me, but for everyone involved in this conflict. But when I saw those smug faces, when I heard them discussing property values and profit margins, while completely ignoring the human cost of their actions, an idea began forming in my mind. It was dangerous, probably illegal, and definitely the kind of thing that could backfire spectacularly. But it was also the only way I could think of to level the playing field against people with unlimited money and no conscience. Did I have the courage to transform from prey into predator? My first defense plan was simple, straightforward, and completely legal. Create a natural barrier between my property and their construction zone. I spent the next weekend planning and purchasing 20 beautiful pine trees from the local nursery, each one carefully selected for height, health, and growth potential. I planted them along the property line, creating what I proudly called my green wall. At least I wouldn't have to look at those hideous mansions every day once they were built, and the trees would provide privacy, reduce noise, and maybe even increase my property value. The trees were genuinely beautiful, and honestly they improved the whole area's appearance dramatically. I spent 2 full weekends digging holes in the rocky coastal soil, buying trees that cost me $60 each, and carefully spacing them for maximum coverage and optimal growth conditions. My back was killing me. My hands were covered in blisters, and I probably spent close to $1,500 on the whole project. But it felt like the best investment I'd ever made, a peaceful solution to an aggressive problem. I was feeling pretty good about this solution, proud of myself for taking the high road and handling the situation like a mature adult, until she showed up. I should have known it wouldn't be that easy. A blonde woman with a face as tight as if she'd been chewing lemons for breakfast strutted straight to my gate 3 days after I finished planting. Just by watching how she walked, I knew trouble had arrived with a capital T. She had this way of moving, like she owned everything she looked at, and her expression suggested she was personally offended by my existence, my trees, my house, and probably my breathing. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I definitely wasn't prepared for the level of entitlement and aggression that was about to come pouring out of her mouth. She introduced herself with the kind of false authority that made it clear she was used to getting her way through intimidation, rather than actual legal power. Her whole demeanor screamed, "I've done this before, and I always win because I make people's lives miserable until they give up." She was wearing an expensive business suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and she carried herself like someone who'd never heard the word no in any context that mattered to her. "I'm Susan Green, president of Ocean View Estates, HOA," she announced, not even bothering with basic pleasantries like, "Good morning," or "Sorry to bother you. You must remove these trees immediately." I looked at her, then at my beautiful pine trees that were already starting to settle into their new soil, then back at her face, which was twisted into an expression of pure outrage. The trees were clearly on my property, well within my property lines according to the survey I had done, and they were healthy, attractive additions to the landscape that any reasonable person would appreciate. "Why?" I asked, genuinely confused by her demand and trying to understand what possible objection she could have to trees on my own land. "They're on my property." Her response actually made me laugh out loud, though not in a good way. "They're blocking our residents' ocean views." She said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like I was some kind of idiot for not understanding that my trees interfered with views from houses that weren't even built yet. I actually had to pause and process that statement because the logical inconsistency was staggering. Ocean views. What about my view? Your 150 mansions are completely blocking the ocean view my family has enjoyed for 3 generations. I couldn't believe the audacity, the sheer nerve of this woman. She was standing on my property demanding I remove trees from my own land because they interfered with hypothetical views from houses that existed only as blueprints. I wish I could tell you, I stayed calm during this conversation, but anyone with a functioning brain would have lost it at that point. The logical inconsistency was mind-boggling. She wanted me to sacrifice my property to protect the views of people who were destroying everyone else's views. Susan's voice got colder and more threatening as I questioned her completely unreasonable demands. "You don't understand the situation you're in. We have excellent lawyers and unlimited budget for legal fees. I suggest you cooperate with our reasonable requests." There was something in her tone that made it clear this wasn't just a suggestion or friendly neighbor advice. This was a direct threat delivered with the confidence of someone who'd successfully intimidated other property owners in the past. I'm not sure why, but something about her delivery made me realize I was dealing with someone who'd done this exact same thing before, probably multiple times. She wasn't just confident. She was experienced at intimidating people into submission through a combination of legal threats, social pressure, and psychological warfare. She handed me a formal letter demanding tree removal within 72 hours, citing completely bogus neighborhood ordinances that didn't actually exist in our area. The letter was printed on expensive legal letterhead and filled with official-sounding language designed to scare people who didn't know their rights. I spent that entire evening researching property law, HOA, regulations, and local ordinances on my computer until my eyes burned from staring at the screen. What I discovered was infuriating, but not surprising, given everything Tom had told me about their tactics. Susan's HOA had absolutely no legal authority over my property since I wasn't part of their development and had never signed any agreements with them. Her demands were completely baseless in legal terms, but she was clearly counting on me being too intimidated or uninformed to fight back effectively. This was obviously her standard playbook: make official-sounding demands, backed by expensive legal letterhead, threaten costly legal action that most people can't afford, and hope people cave under pressure rather than fight for their rights. Well, she picked the wrong guy this time. I'd dealt with enough bureaucratic nonsense in the plumbing business to recognize a bluff when I saw one, and I wasn't about to be intimidated by someone whose only real power came from other people's fear. 3 days later, I woke up to discover 8 of my beautiful pine trees had been poisoned with herbicide poured around their root systems during the night. My security cameras captured 2 strangers doing this at 2 a.m., moving systematically from tree to tree with spray bottles and what looked like professional grade plant killer. They had officially declared war on me personally. I actually couldn't believe they'd go that far, that they'd escalate from legal threats to actual criminal destruction of property, destroying someone's property in the middle of the night while they slept. That's when I realized Susan Green wasn't just some bossy HOA president with delusions of authority. She was willing to break laws, commit crimes, and cross ethical lines to get what she wanted. The dead trees were a message delivered in the clearest possible terms: comply with our demands or face escalating consequences that will make your life increasingly miserable. I called Frank Miller, my lawyer, an old college friend who'd helped me with various legal issues over the years, and sent him the video evidence of the tree poisoning. Frank had handled several property disputes for me and was familiar with my situation. "This is clear criminal property damage," Frank said after reviewing the footage carefully. "I'll send a warning letter immediately, and we should consider filing criminal charges." The HOA received Frank's strongly worded legal warning and temporarily stopped their harassment campaign, probably to regroup and plan their next move. But Susan called me later that day, and her voice was ice cold with barely controlled rage. "You won this time, but the battle isn't over by a long shot." The way she said it made my blood run cold because I could hear the promise of escalation in every word. This woman was declaring war on my family, my property, and my entire way of life. I wondered if I'd pushed Susan Green too far with my resistance to her demands, or if this was just the beginning of a much more serious conflict. I turned on the bathroom faucet the next morning, expecting my usual strong water pressure, and not a single drop came out. The silence was deafening after 20 years of reliable morning routines. I checked the kitchen tap, the shower, the laundry room, even the outdoor hose connections, completely dry throughout my entire house. My heart was pounding as the implications sank in. At first I thought maybe there was a neighborhood-wide issue or some kind of municipal water problem, but when I called the water company, they said there were no reported problems anywhere in my area. Other houses on my street had normal water pressure. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't an accident or coincidence. This was Susan Green escalating her psychological warfare campaign, and she just crossed a line that made everything deeply personal. No water meant no basic human necessities in modern life. No showers, no cooking, no cleaning, no functioning toilets. This was designed to make my life unbearable and force me to surrender my property rights or face the prospect of living like a refugee in my own home. The cruelty was breathtaking, but also strategically brilliant in a sociopathic way. I walked outside to check my main water valve, and what I found made my stomach drop like a stone thrown into a deep well. The valve was locked tight with an industrial padlock and sealed with what looked like professional-grade adhesive that would require special tools to remove. This wasn't just turned off by someone acting on impulse. It was sabotaged with careful planning and professional execution. I actually stood there staring at it for a full minute because I couldn't process what I was seeing. Someone had deliberately cut off my water supply and done it in a way that would be expensive, time-consuming, and technically challenging to fix. This went way beyond property disputes or neighborly disagreements. This was a direct attack on my ability to live in my own home, to maintain basic sanitation and health standards. The message was clear: surrender or suffer the consequences of defying people with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. I felt violated in a way that's hard to describe, like someone had broken into my house and stolen something essential to my survival. I called Frank immediately, and he was even angrier than I was when I described the situation. "This is criminal behavior," he shouted into the phone. "This is harassment, possibly extortion, and definitely illegal interference with utilities. We'll sue them into the ground." But as angry as Frank was, I knew lawsuits take months or years to resolve. Meanwhile, I had no water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, or basic sanitation. No showers, no functioning toilets, no way to wash dishes or clothes. This was psychological warfare designed to break my will, and honestly, it was working better than I wanted to admit. I was starting to doubt myself, starting to wonder if maybe I should just give up and move somewhere else where I could live in peace. The stress was getting to me in ways I hadn't expected, affecting my sleep, my appetite, my ability to concentrate on work. Susan had calculated this perfectly: cut off the water, wait for me to break under the pressure, then swoop in with a lowball offer for my property that would seem reasonable to someone who just wanted the nightmare to end. But then my plumber instincts kicked in like a survival mechanism that had been dormant for too long. With 20 years of experience installing, repairing, and understanding water systems throughout this coastal region, I began studying the water system blueprints for the entire area with renewed focus and professional curiosity. If they could cut my water through some kind of centralized control, there must be some master water source controlling everything in this area. I spent hours at the county planning office reviewing utility maps, construction permits, and infrastructure diagrams that most people never see. That's when I decided to visit Harold Wayne, the region's most famous retired plumber, who was legendary among everyone in the trade. Everyone in the business knew Harold's reputation. If anyone understood this area's water systems better than the people who designed them, it would be him. Harold had installed half the plumbing in this county over his 40-year career and had worked on projects ranging from simple house repairs to major municipal infrastructure. Harold lived in a small house about 10 minutes away, surrounded by the kind of organized chaos that only a master tradesman could create and navigate effectively. His garage was full of pipe fittings, valve components, diagnostic tools, and technical manuals that most modern plumbers had never seen. When I explained my situation in detail, Harold's weathered face darkened with an expression that combined professional interest with personal anger. "Evan, I know the water system here like the back of my hand," Harold said, leaning back in his workshop chair. "I've worked on every major installation in this area for 4 decades. But why are you specifically interested in that new mansion development?" When I told him about Susan Green, the tree poisoning, and the water cutoff sabotage, Harold got this look in his eyes that was part anger, part excitement, and part something I couldn't quite identify. Something that told me Harold had his own very personal reasons for wanting revenge against this particular organization. That mansion development has a super fancy water system that cost them over $2 million to install, Harold said, leaning forward with obvious professional interest and growing excitement. All artificial rivers flowing around each house, decorative fountains, koi ponds, elaborate irrigation systems, the whole luxury package that rich people think they need. But everything depends on one giant main control valve that regulates pressure and flow for the entire development. My pulse quickened as I realized where this conversation was heading. "And where exactly is that valve located?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the excitement building in my chest. Harold actually laughed a sound that contained decades of professional satisfaction and poetic justice. "Right next to your property line. They put it there for easy maintenance access, never realizing it was next to their enemy's land. The irony is beautiful. Susan Green's development handed you the key to their destruction." Harold's motivation became crystal clear when he mentioned his granddaughter, and his voice got quiet with barely controlled rage. "This HOA once harassed my granddaughter when she inherited a small property from my late wife. They forced her to sell her land dirt cheap through constant legal pressure and intimidation. She was a single mother, couldn't afford to fight their expensive lawyers, so she gave up and moved across the county. It broke her heart and destroyed her dreams of raising her kids near the ocean." Harold's hands clenched into fists as he spoke. "They destroyed her life for their profit margins, and I've been waiting for the right opportunity to get payback ever since. It's time for justice." When Harold mentioned that valve and I realized what he was suggesting, I felt like I'd found the golden key to evening the odds in this completely unfair fight. But did I have the courage to use it? Harold and I spent hours surveying the area, noting patrol patterns and weak spots. We couldn't afford to waste time. This was the one shot we had. Every second counted. The valve was heavily guarded, but not enough to stop us. With the right tools we could get through. But if we were caught, the consequences would be severe. The security patrols only checked the main entrance and common areas, never wandering back to the utility zones where the real infrastructure was located. The valve was cleverly hidden behind decorative landscaping and artificial rock formations, making it invisible from the main road. During our reconnaissance, we timed the patrols, mapped the camera coverage, and identified the blind spots where we could work without being detected. I'm not sure what I was thinking during those planning sessions. Part of me felt like we were plotting something way too dangerous. But then I'd remember waking up without water, and my resolve would strengthen like steel being forged in fire. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice for Harold's granddaughter, for Tom's struggles, for all the families who'd been forced out by these people. We weren't just two guys planning mischief. We were resistance fighters preparing to strike back against corporate bullies who thought money made them untouchable. Harold brought professional knowledge and decades of experience, while I brought the motivation of someone who'd been pushed too far. Saturday night at 2 a.m., when the mansion community was in deepest sleep, we made our move. My heart pounded like war drums echoing in my chest, but my determination never wavered despite the fear coursing through my veins. Harold brought professional tools that looked like they belonged in a spy movie: lockpicks, electronic bypass devices, voltage testers, and various plumbing implements I'd never seen before, despite my 20 years in the business. We approached through the wooded area behind my property, stepping carefully to avoid motion sensors they'd installed at the main entrance. As we neared the valve, the tension in the air thickened. One wrong move, and the whole plan would unravel. I could almost hear the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. The adrenaline was incredible, like nothing I'd ever experienced, but also terrifying because I knew we were crossing a line that would change everything. The electronic lock system was more complex than Harold had expected. He worked on it for 15 anxious minutes, while I kept watch, sweat pouring down my work despite the cool night air. Harold's hands moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades solving mechanical puzzles, but even he seemed challenged by this particular setup. The manufacturers had apparently upgraded their technology since Harold's active years. "Almost got it," Harold whispered, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for what felt like hours. When the lock finally clicked open with a satisfying mechanical sound, the relief was overwhelming. But that was just the beginning of our real challenges, because Harold immediately discovered a problem that threatened our entire plan. But when we opened the main valve housing, there was no sound of water flowing through the system like Harold had expected. He cursed under his breath. The system has a secondary valve at the other end of the development. We need to adjust both valves to control the water pressure effectively. That meant crossing 200 meters of the mansion complex right through the heart of enemy territory, where security cameras and motion sensors were more concentrated. This was 10 times more dangerous than our original plan, but there was no other choice if we wanted our sabotage to be effective. Looking back, I should have realized this was the point where we crossed from simple mischief into something that could have serious legal consequences. Would you stay quiet or fight back if you were me? Because at that moment, standing in the darkness with Harold waiting for my decision, I had to choose between retreating safely or committing fully to this risky plan. Getting to the second valve required military-level stealth. We crawled under decorative bridges, hid behind artificial rock formations, and imported palm trees, and froze like statues every time we heard any sound that might indicate human presence. The whole complex was like a maze of fake natural features, all designed to make rich people feel like they lived in some kind of tropical paradise rather than a manufactured community built on stolen coastline. We had to avoid at least 3 security cameras that we could see, and probably more that were hidden in the landscaping. Twice we had to hide in the shadows when late-night residents walked their dogs along the artificial pathways, and once a security golf cart drove past, close enough for us to hear the guard's radio crackling with routine check-ins. My knees were scraped raw from crawling across rough decorative stones, my clothes were torn from thorny bushes, and my nerves were completely shot from the constant fear of discovery. But Harold moved with the determination of someone who'd been waiting years for this opportunity, and his focus kept me going when I wanted to give up and go home. After an hour of heart-stopping tension, we finally reached the secondary valve system, and Harold began adjusting it to the half-open position. He explained in whispered technical terms that water would still flow, but without enough pressure to maintain the entire artificial river system throughout the development. Reducing pressure by 30% would cause obvious problems, but wouldn't immediately shut everything down completely. It would look like a gradual system failure rather than obvious sabotage, giving us plausible deniability if anyone investigated. Mission accomplished, and somehow no one had seen us despite our amateur stealth skills. Harold and I retreated like ghosts in the night, covering our tracks and making sure we left no evidence behind that could be traced back to us. For the first time after a week without water in my own home, I actually slept well that night, knowing that tomorrow morning the HOA would begin to taste the helplessness and frustration I'd been experiencing. But as my head hit the pillow and exhaustion finally overtook adrenaline, one question kept haunting my dreams. As I reached for the valve handle, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the gravel behind me. We were being followed. The next morning, I stepped onto my balcony with my coffee feeling like a general, surveying a battlefield where the first shots had been fired. The mansion complex spread out below me like an expensive movie set, and I could already see the first signs of our nighttime handiwork beginning to take effect. Water levels in the little decorative rivers had visibly dropped overnight, and the elaborate fountain systems that had been running constantly were now operating at reduced capacity. Guilt gnawed at me for a moment, but it quickly faded. They had it coming. All I felt now was satisfaction. They were finally paying for what they did to my family. This was justice, not revenge. They had started this war by cutting off my basic human necessities. Now they were going to learn what it felt like to have their luxury amenities threatened by forces beyond their control. By the second day, the fountains had stopped, and the koi were listless in the shallow water. The artificial paradise was crumbling right before their eyes. I could see maintenance workers running around with confused expressions, checking equipment that appeared to be working perfectly from a technical standpoint. The workers ran around confused testing pumps and resetting systems that couldn't solve the real problem. They were out of their depth. They had no idea that the issue wasn't with their fancy automated systems or expensive imported equipment. It was with the water pressure feeding those systems from a source they'd never think to check. Harold's plan was working perfectly, creating exactly the kind of mysterious system failure that would frustrate engineers and waste enormous amounts of money on unnecessary repairs. The problems looked completely natural, like equipment failure or design flaws rather than deliberate sabotage. By day 3, disaster became undeniable across the entire community. Foul odors began rising from the dried-up artificial rivers, where algae was dying and fish waste was concentrating in increasingly shallow pools. Residents started complaining loudly to anyone who would listen, and I could hear arguments echoing across the complex from my balcony. The sounds of conflict and frustration carried clearly in the ocean air. From my front row seat to this unfolding drama, I watched Susan screaming at the technical team with increasing desperation. "You're being paid $5,000 daily to solve this problem. Find the cause immediately or you're all fired." I actually felt a little bad for those workers. They were competent professionals just doing their jobs and had no idea they were looking for a problem that existed completely outside their area of expertise. The HOA was in chaos. Complaints flooded in from every direction. The development was failing, and Susan couldn't control the fallout. Engineers, technicians, and specialists crawled all over the development with expensive diagnostic equipment, but no one found the problem because they only checked equipment and electrical systems. They never thought to examine the main control valve, especially not one located on adjacent property. I was watching this whole investigation unfold from my front row seat, and it was like watching people search frantically for their glasses while wearing them on their heads. The irony was delicious and deeply satisfying. They were spending more money on useless diagnostics than it would have cost to fix my water problem in the first place. Every day brought new experts, new theories, and new expensive attempts to solve a problem that couldn't be fixed. Arguments started erupting throughout the mansion complex as residents blamed each other, the contractors, the HOA, board, and anyone else they could think of. Property values were already starting to drop because nobody wanted to buy expensive houses next to stagnant, smelly ponds that attracted insects and created health concerns. I overheard multiple emergency HOA meetings where Susan was losing control. "I don't care how much money it costs, someone is sabotaging us. Check all security cameras." But the cameras only covered the main entrance and common areas, not the utility zones where Harold and I had worked our magic. Susan's paranoia was growing, but her investigations were going in completely wrong directions. Have you ever seen justice taste this sweet? Because watching these entitled people face real consequences for their actions was more satisfying than I'd imagined possible. By day 5, the entire artificial river system had turned into stinking mud puddles that attracted flies, mosquitoes, and other insects that made outdoor activities unpleasant. The whole complex looked like a luxury development hit by drought and plague simultaneously. Sitting in my house watching this unfold through my window, I laughed harder than I had in years. This feeling was amazing, watching enemies destroy themselves while searching frantically for an invisible saboteur. Residents were threatening to sue the HOA for failure to maintain promised amenities. Contractors were demanding payment for repairs that didn't work, and Susan was having increasingly public meltdowns in the middle of the community center. The stress was clearly taking its toll on everyone involved, and the community that had been built on exclusivity and luxury was falling apart from internal conflicts and unresolved problems. But seeing the desperation in Susan's eyes during one of her increasingly frantic public meetings, watching her lose control of the situation she'd created through her own arrogance and cruelty, I wondered, had I gone too far in my quest for justice? Or was this exactly what she deserved for destroying other people's lives? By day 3, it was clear the sabotage was irreversible. Their entire luxury community was unraveling, and I was just getting started. Sunday morning at 9 a.m., my doorbell rang with the kind of insistent buzzing that immediately puts your stomach in knots and makes you think about every questionable thing you've ever done in your entire life. Through the window, I saw 2 police cars parked outside my gate, and my blood turned to ice water flowing through veins that suddenly felt too small for the panic coursing through my system. This was it. They'd figured it out, somehow found evidence linking me to the valve sabotage, or maybe Harold had been caught and given them my name. Officers Davis and Rodriguez stood at my door, both looking official and serious, in that way that makes innocent people feel guilty, and guilty people consider making a run for it. The officers stood there, eyes scanning me like they could read my every move. I tried to keep calm, but my heart raced. "I don't know anything about that," I said, my voice steady. It wasn't technically a lie. I really was dealing with my water situation and the ongoing harassment. I just wasn't mentioning the specific methods I'd chosen to address the problem. The officers exchanged glances in that way cops do when they're trying to read someone's expression for signs of deception or guilt. I could tell they were analyzing my body language, my tone of voice, and probably my eye movements for any indication that I was hiding something important. The silence stretched uncomfortably as I tried to look confused and innocent rather than terrified and guilty. That's when Susan appeared, like a vengeful spirit, arriving right after the police with her face red with anger and her hair looking like she hadn't slept in days. Susan was losing control. She had always been calm, but now her eyes were wild with frustration. "You'll regret this," she spat, barely holding her composure. Her voice had this hysterical edge that made her sound unhinged rather than authoritative, like someone who was cracking under pressure and lashing out at the nearest available target. Officer Rodriguez asked the obvious question with professional skepticism. "Do you have any evidence linking Mr. Carter to this alleged sabotage?" Susan's response was pure desperation, masquerading as logic. "He's a plumber. He has the ability and knowledge to do this. He threatened revenge against our development. He's been hostile from the beginning." I actually had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at that reasoning, because it was like saying someone was guilty of bank robbery because they knew how to count money. The officers looked increasingly skeptical of Susan's accusations, especially since she couldn't provide any actual physical evidence beyond my profession and proximity to the development. Her desperation was making her look less credible rather than more convincing, and I could see the cops starting to wonder if this was just a neighborhood dispute blown out of proportion by stress and paranoia. But then I remembered something Frank had told me during our consultation about property rights, utility access, and the legal complexities of infrastructure that crosses property boundaries. I pulled out my property survey maps and played what I hoped would be my trump card. "Officers, are you certain that control valve belongs to the HOA? I want you to check the exact property boundaries and see who actually owns the land where their main water controls are located." Both officers looked at the maps with growing interest, then at each other with expressions that suggested this case was getting more legally complicated than they'd expected when they responded to what seemed like a simple vandalism report. Susan's face went pale as she realized where this was heading and what the implications might be for her accusations. Frank Miller appeared just in time, like a guardian angel in a business suit, carrying a briefcase full of legal documents that would change everything. "Officer Davis, I'm Mr. Carter's attorney. That control valve sits within my client's property boundaries according to official county records. Here's the official survey map, and here are the utility easement agreements that show the valve location." And the moment Frank spread out those documents on my kitchen table, the entire dynamic shifted dramatically. Suddenly, I wasn't the suspected saboteur who had been destroying other people's property. I was the property owner whose land was being accessed without permission by people who had no legal right to be there. Frank had obviously been preparing for this confrontation and came armed with documentation that proved the valve was technically on my property, making their access potentially illegal rather than my interference criminal. The police began investigating the HOA's history more thoroughly and discovered 7 formal complaints about harassment from this organization in the past 2 years. Other residents had filed reports about intimidation, property damage, questionable legal tactics, and systematic campaigns to force people out of their homes. Susan panicked as the focus shifted away from me and toward her organization's methods and history. "We need to arrest him immediately. He's a criminal," she demanded. But Officer Davis was now focused on entirely different questions that didn't involve handcuffs for me. "Miss Green will also need to investigate the illegal water cut off at Mr. Carter's house. Do you have documentation authorizing that action? Did you obtain proper permits before accessing utility controls on his property?" The tables had completely turned, and Susan realized she could face serious legal trouble for the utilities sabotage at my property. When the police left without arresting anyone, Susan's tone shifted to something colder, harder. You think you've won? We have more resources than you can imagine, and we always win. I knew she wasn't bluffing about escalating this conflict further, but was I ready for the final battle that would determine who controlled this coastline? As Susan turned to leave, her words echoed in my ears. This isn't over. I knew she'd come for me again, but this time I was ready. 2 weeks later, I sat in the courthouse facing the biggest legal showdown of my life, surrounded by an atmosphere of tension that felt like electricity before a thunderstorm. Susan and her lawyer, Richard Coleman, occupied the plaintiff's table like generals preparing for war, while Frank and I represented what felt like David facing Goliath in a system designed to favor people with unlimited money. Richard Coleman was a regional hotshot with 20 years of experience destroying small property owners in courtrooms exactly like this one. The courtroom felt enormous and intimidating, with high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and an atmosphere that made me feel like a small-town plumber who was completely out of his league. I couldn't help wondering if I was in over my head fighting against legal professionals who had probably handled hundreds of cases like this. But Frank had assured me we had a solid case based on property rights and documented harassment, and I trusted him completely. Plus, I had a secret weapon that nobody in that courtroom suspected or could have prepared for. Richard opened his presentation with dramatic flair. Your Honor, defendant deliberately sabotaged my client's water system, causing over $2 million in damages to a luxury residential development that serves this community's economic interests. We have video evidence of him near the control valve area on multiple occasions, demonstrating opportunity and intent. They showed security footage of me walking near the valve during my scouting mission with Harold. The video looked damning without proper context, and I watched Judge Thompson's expression carefully for signs of how he was interpreting the evidence. Susan added her testimony with theatrical precision. He threatened to get revenge on us for our perfectly legal development project. He's been hostile and uncooperative from the very beginning. I actually felt my palms sweating as the evidence mounted against me, even though I knew we had strong counter-arguments. The prosecution was building a compelling narrative that painted me as a vindictive neighbor who'd committed serious crimes out of petty spite. In court, I could feel the tide turning. Frank's arguments were solid, and for the first time, Susan was on the defensive. She wasn't used to that. Your Honor, my client was merely walking on his own property. More importantly, my client is the victim of illegal water, cut-off criminal property damage, and continuous harassment by this HOA. That has a documented pattern of forcing residents out through intimidation. He presented evidence of the herbicide attack on my trees, the water sabotage at my house, and the HOA's documented history of harassment. Frank methodically built a case that painted Susan's organization as the real criminals in this situation, people who used their resources to destroy lives and drive families away from homes they had owned for generations. Richard objected repeatedly, but Frank was building a compelling narrative that shifted blame away from me and toward an organization with a pattern of illegal behavior that had finally met resistance from someone who refused to be intimidated. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife, as both sides presented their evidence and legal arguments. Richard demanded maximum damages with righteous indignation. That's just an excuse for criminal behavior. He sabotaged the system for personal revenge. $2 million in property damage cannot be ignored or excused by neighborhood disputes. Judge Thompson looked thoughtful as he reviewed the evidence, clearly weighing the competing claims and trying to determine the truth. The court needs more time to review evidence and determine exact property boundaries before making a ruling, Judge Thompson began, but Frank interrupted with our final gambit that would change everything. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Time to reveal the truth about who really controlled that water valve and what rights I actually had regarding infrastructure on my own property. Frank's words hit like a hammer. The valve is on his property, Susan. Your claim is invalid. And now my client decides to demonstrate those rights by returning all that water to its natural state. I pulled out my phone and texted Harold, our prearranged signal that we'd planned for exactly this moment. Do it now. Richard and Susan looked confused and increasingly alarmed. What are they doing? Stop them. But it was too late to prevent what was about to happen. Harold was already at the valve with tools and years of experience, and he knew exactly what to do to create the most dramatic demonstration of property rights in legal history. Justice was about to flow like water through the HOA's artificial paradise, washing away their arrogance and revealing the true balance of power in this conflict. Without warning, the valve opened. Water rushed through the system, flooding the entire development. The luxury homes they had built for the wealthy now turned into a massive, expensive swimming pool. Within minutes, chaos erupted outside the courthouse as emergency sirens began wailing in the distance, like air raid warnings during wartime. Water from the main river, which had been reduced to a trickle for over a week, suddenly rushed into the mansion complex's dried-out system at full pressure. The irony was absolutely perfect. Susan's luxury water features had become the instrument of her destruction. The very amenities that justified the high property values were now destroying those same properties through uncontrolled flooding that would cause millions in damage and render many homes uninhabitable. The court clerk ran in shouting like a herald of doom. "Your Honor, there's an emergency flood report at Ocean View Estates, multiple structures flooding, residents evacuating, emergency services responding." Judge Thompson looked out the window, seeing fire trucks and ambulances racing by with their lights flashing and sirens wailing. "Oh my God, what's happening out there?" Susan collapsed right there in the courtroom when she realized what was happening to her precious development. "My mansions, $50 million investment going underwater," she cried before fainting completely on the courthouse floor. Richard Coleman stood there speechless for the first time in his career, realizing his client's case had literally been washed away by forces beyond anyone's control or legal authority. Judge Thompson, trying not to smile at the poetic justice unfolding outside his courtroom, made his ruling with obvious satisfaction. "I think the property dispute has been naturally resolved through the exercise of legitimate property rights. Court adjourned indefinitely so everyone can go help with rescue efforts." The legal consequences for the HOA were devastating and permanent. They had to spend $10 million on flood damage repair across the entire development. I was declared completely innocent by the court, since the valve was legally on my property. Susan Green was officially expelled from HOA presidency by furious residents who blamed her for the disaster and the financial ruin that followed. The mansion complex lost 80% of its value overnight, and most families had to sell at massive losses and relocate to areas where they couldn't terrorize their neighbors with impunity. 6 months later, I still sit on my balcony sipping coffee and watching the sunrise over the ocean. The only difference, a giant lake next door, a reminder not to mess with a plumber who knows where the water comes from. Susan Green gone. As for me, my beach life's back. The beach paths reopened and my water's restored. No one dares mess with my utilities now. If you're still here, drop a comment, like, and subscribe. If you want to support the channel, hit the thanks button below. Thanks for hanging out. See you in the next one.
QA Stories thanks you for hanging out today. Don't forget to binge a few more. Trust us, you'll be hooked.